To be honest, I think it was just really a struggle as soon as I got back to Stanford. And I think this is kind of the unfortunate part of the PhD. It's hard to, the median outcome is not that great, unfortunately. And it's really, really hard, especially when, you're in this sort of very isolated environment and you deal with a lot of failures. And the PhD is naturally going to expose all of your flaws.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Tech Track series, where I talk to interesting people in tech and their story. And so today I'm talking to Firas, who I've known for a very long time because we went to undergrad together at Stanford. And he went on to do a PhD, first at MIT and then transferred to Stanford. And he went on to start a company where he's a co-founder and CTO at neo.tax, which applies machine learning to automate taxes for small businesses. So in our conversation, we're talking about Firas's journey, how he decided to do computer science, do a PhD, and also start a company during the pandemic. And so I'm really excited for a lot of the lessons that he's learned over the past few years. And I think he's also just a really interesting person outside of computer science as well. So thanks, Firas, for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Rahul.
Yeah, okay. So I want to start out with rapid fire. I feel like it's a really fun way just to kind of get to know you very quickly. So first off, 3 words to describe yourself.
I would say like inquisitive and playful and gregarious.
A lifestyle change you made during the pandemic.
Technically, I made these changes before the pandemic started, but they really kind of accelerated. So I started doing yoga summer of like 2019, and I did it like once a week. And then once the pandemic started, I needed a way to exercise in my house and not take up a lot of space. So yoga became something that I did maybe 3 or 4 times a week. And then I also used to meditate a lot, but I wasn't super diligent about it. So I would meditate maybe 3 or 4 times a week. But especially at the beginning of the pandemic when, everyone's stress levels were really elevated and people were really freaking out about COVID, I really relied on that to kind of keep me grounded. And I do it pretty much every single day, which really, really helps me.
And then last rapid fire, what is one piece of advice that you've gotten recently or even before that has changed your life?
So the piece of advice is that like the voice inside your head isn't necessarily who you are. That reminder of, just because you have this inner critic inside your head, for example, it doesn't mean that whatever is being said is true, right? And in some ways, like, it's okay to have that voice. In some ways, it's actually really helpful. It keeps you honest. It keeps you grounded. But it doesn't mean that's who you are. And so I think, just like there's a multitude of perspectives that you encounter in your life, there's also a multitude of perspectives that you can encounter within yourself. And you have to give space for that.
Yeah, I like that. I want to start just by talking about very briefly today, like what you're doing and where you are. And then I want to backtrack about, your journey about Stanford and the PhD program. So I guess to start off with, what's your day-to-day look like? You're CTO and co-founder of neo.tax. Like you're in Mountain View. So how big is the team and like how are your hours? Where do you go? Things like that.
Yeah, so the team is 11 people. We're a pretty small team, although I guess we've grown quite a bit because
11 is actually quite big. I somehow thought that it was like just like 3 or 4 of you, but 11 is actually quite a big team already.
Yeah. So, we raised our seed round in June. At the time, it was just 3 of us. And then we grew to 11 since then. I guess we've had to grow really fast because we're trying to, get as many customers as possible. And the market is really heated up in our space. So we're trying to, stay competitive with our competitors. But basically my day-to-day is, I wake up, I wake up, usually do a 10-minute meditation in the morning. I, make breakfast, I eat, I usually catch up on the news and stuff. I also lately have been doing I spent a couple minutes sort of playing different puzzles online, which I know is kind of weird, but this kind of goes back to my childhood. I used to do puzzles all the time in my spare time. So I'll do a couple puzzles on the New York Times website, read the New York Times newsletter, and then, I'll either do maybe a 15-minute workout, or if I don't have time because I've got a bunch of early morning calls, I'll get dressed, showered, eat breakfast, and then I'll head into the office. So we do work out of an office, even though, yes, we are in a pandemic. And I think the reason why we decided to do that is because we really wanted to be co-located and work together in person as much as possible, just for the sake of speed, right? Like when you're a startup, especially in the infancy of the startup, you want to make sure that you're always moving as fast as possible.
Mm.
When we started the company, we were remote. I was actually in Dallas, staying with my family there, and Ibrahim, my co-founder, was in Sunnyvale. So we would just do everything over Zoom. We even fundraised over Zoom, actually. And then at some point, he floated the idea of working together in person. To be honest, I was against it at first. I thought it was a bad idea. I felt very comfortable in Dallas. I had a very good routine there with my family. It was really nice spending time with family. I think that was kind of one of the blessings in disguise during the pandemic. But eventually, I kind of came around and realized, okay, we need to prioritize this, and we need to focus on moving as fast as possible. So I moved back to the Bay Area, got this place in Mountain View. We got this office in Mountain View for very cheap, thankfully, because of the real estate markets nosedive during the pandemic. And once I get into the office, it's just, I think the fun thing about being a CTO is that you get to wear lots of different hats. And so there's team meetings, obviously, there's talking to engineers, there's coding, there's code reviews, there's customer calls, there's like strategic plannings, there's investor calls, there's sometimes, Ibrahim and I will go on walks around the office complex. I think we're in a pretty good spot for that. I like going for walks in general. I think, walking kind of unlocks a deeper level of thinking.
Yeah, totally.
You can get otherwise. So, that's my day to day. It's kind of like the PhD was, except I talk to a lot more people, which is what I like. So,
I like that. I imagine a lot broader than just research, because you're talking to investors, you're talking to employees, you're talking to your co-founder. It's like very different kinds of conversations, I imagine.
Yeah. And it's a lot of translation. It's a lot of like going back and forth. So like, an engineer or a data scientist will tell me something. Then I have to translate it to someone else, for example, like our designer. Or, we have a third co-founder. His name is Steven. He is a former IRS agent. Since the company, we are a tax company at the end of the day, so we need someone with domain expertise. Steven is that domain expertise, right? He's like, your 10x or 100x accountant. He's just brilliant. But he's not a technical person, right? So I have to constantly translate technical things into layman's terms for him, make sure that he understands what's going on, and then vice versa, right?
Right.
So it's always bi-directional. And I kind of feel like I am that sort of like interlocutor in the company. Because there aren't many folks who have the responsibility for doing that, right? For being the interface between every single party. But to be honest, I really enjoy that. Like, I think that's really fun. It's like a skill that's, I'd say, pretty unique, and it's a skill that's, you can only really develop it by having the experience of talking to lots of different folks, right, throughout the course of your life.
Totally. And actually, I want to definitely later on get into this idea of how you decided on tax as the domain for your company, and like what advice you would have to other people who who have a technical background and who are trying to figure out what to do. But before that, let's start with the your genesis and your story coming into computer science.
My founding story, not neo.
Your founding story, yeah, exactly. Not neo. We'll get to neo.tax a little bit later. Okay. So you grew up in the Dallas area, if I recall correctly, right? And then you came to Stanford. So I think maybe we can start there. When you came to Stanford, how did you figure out what you wanted to major in?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So maybe a good way to put this in context is to talk about why I wanted to go to Stanford in the first place. Because when I was in high school, Rahul, I don't know if you had this problem when you were growing up in Michigan, but for me, I was always kind of oscillating back and forth between the humanities and science and engineering. So when I went to school, for example, like the gifted and talented programs at my local public high school were all centered around the liberal arts and the humanities. So I took those classes and I really, really enjoyed them. But after a while, I thought that I wasn't getting a good math and science education. So then I switched schools and went to really a math and science academy. It was called the Texas Academy of Math and Science. And it was it's a public charter school. Technically, I was living away from home for the last 2 years of high school, but it was fairly close to home. And then after 2 years there, I felt like, okay, I'm not actually getting enough liberal arts, right? So when I was applying to colleges, I really wanted to go to a school that had the breadth that could satisfy any interest that I wanted. And Stanford felt to me like the optimal choice in that regard, right? It's funny, I mean, when I tell my friends that, for example, I never applied to MIT, for example, or Caltech or Carnegie Mellon, they're really surprised because I ended up doing a PhD in computer science. But at the time, I was very averse to going to a school that was strictly engineering or strictly.
Interesting. So at that point, you were thinking
that I was looking for.
You were thinking that you would major in engineering or computer science, but that it was also important to you that in addition to a strong engineering program, it also had liberal arts.
Well, technically, I wasn't even sure about that. So,
Okay.
but for example, like when I applied, I said I wanted to major in chemistry and international relations.
Oh,
And
wow.
the really funny thing is, I didn't take a single chemistry class. And I took I think one international relations class, and I wasn't a huge fan. And then I was like, yeah, I'm gonna put this off to the side.
It's pretty similar to me. Like when I was applying, I was like, I'm gonna do physics for sure. I'm gonna like, either physics or like something in that realm of like,
Right, right,
maybe something theoretical and electrical engineering. And I
right.
never took a single physics class. Like I did computer science, and it's like that's what I did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is, I think also you and I came to Stanford right after the economic collapse in '08.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's exactly when computer science started to become super popular. Right? Like we were right at that inflection point. And so
Yeah.
I remember when I got to Stanford, I actually switched from chemistry to physics, right? And I didn't
Hmm.
take any international relations classes until like the very end of freshman year. And after a year of taking physics classes, I was actually like just kind of frustrated and I felt like I was at a dead end. And
Hmm.
so my sophomore year, fall quarter, I told myself, okay, I need to sort of cast a wider net again. I need to, do a breadth first search. And so I took electrical engineering class, an economics class, a computer science class. I took one more physics class. Um, and I took the computer science class because my freshman year, I mean, you can testify to this, everyone was taking CS 106A,
Yeah.
right? Everyone loved taking it with Mehran. They loved Jerry Kane. They loved Eric Roberts. And my roommate was doing it. He was having a blast building Breakout. And I was low-key jealous, right? I really actually thought that this could be a lot of fun. I didn't do it because I had no exposure to computer science at my high school, which is kind of ironic that I went to math and science school. You would expect
Hmm.
them to have computer science offerings, but they really didn't. Um, and none of my friends in high school did computer science either. Like all of my math and science friends, especially, they were all taking lots of math classes, right? And maybe some science classes, but it was more math than it was science.
Yeah.
Um, but man, I took CS 106A fall quarter sophomore year, and I fell in love with it like immediately.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why I fell in love with it was because I talked about this earlier, right? How I was going back and forth between liberal arts versus sciences, right? I think computer science is one of the few domains where it really is both an art and a science.
Hmm.
And so I felt like, okay, I finally found a domain that captured both parts of my brain, right? I remember actually like maybe the first week of class, Mehran picked up the textbook and he said, this book is called The Art and Science of Java, right? Now, why is it called The Art of Java? That seems kind of weird, right? Because it's a computer science class. You wouldn't expect there to be an artistic element to computer science.
Yeah.
And then he told me something that really blew my mind, right? He told it to the whole class. He said, when we give out our first assignment next week, we're going to ask you to program Carol the robot. We'll give you some very simple tasks, right? And there's roughly 400 students in this class. And assuming nobody cheats on this submission, everyone is going to have a unique submission for this assignment, even though the problems are super basic. To me, that didn't make any sense. I was like, but if the goal is just to like, pick up a beeper and put it from one corner to the other, how many different ways could you do that? How many ways could you like solve a simple task like that? It turns out that like, writing a program is a lot like painting a painting, right? Or writing a novel. Even if you give someone a very, very simple task like paint a house or, write a short story of no more than a couple paragraphs. It turns out that everyone has their unique perspective and their sort of unique fingerprint when they develop that solution, because everyone's mind works differently. And to me, that, in a way, that's kind of the definition of art, right? It's like each person's perspective on this is very, very unique. And you can give them a set of constraints, but how they decide to compose those constraints to build something new, that's a fundamentally creative process that no two humans can do the same.
Yeah.
That's also why in high school I really enjoyed music. I played clarinet in the youth orchestra, and music was this very scientific endeavor that was also, again, fundamentally creative.
Hmm.
And to me, computer science was kind of a natural extension of that. So
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that like it sounds like computer science fit that bill of like marrying the artistic side and the scientific side. Also, like you mentioned, the inflection point where like at this point, 2009, 2010, 11 is really where computer science jobs started becoming really high paying and like everyone wanted that. I think there's also a third component, right? Like I think you alluded to this as well, which is that Stanford did such a good job of teaching these intro classes, right? Like it was so popular because it was like cool to like be part of these intro classes and like building out these cool assignments, right? So I wonder like how much of the teaching appealed to you, like versus like
so much,
teaching for like physics. I don't remember the intro classes for like I don't know, electrical engineering being that exciting.
They were not. They were not at all. So I took the Physics 60 series my freshman year. I met some awesome folks, by the way, in those
Yeah.
classes. Like these folks ended up becoming my really good friends. I met some really smart people in those classes. What's ironic is I saw all those people again in my computer science classes because I think they, like me, realized, okay, I came here, I wanted to study something, scientifically intense, right? And I'm going to take the hardest physics classes at Stanford. I'm going to like really master this. And then it turned out that because it wasn't super well taught, and it's no fault of, I think, the department at Stanford. I think it's just that the computer science department at Stanford is so good at teaching and so good at, taking these abstract concepts, making them very concrete, making them very accessible for students.
Yeah, and the other aspect I think is that compared to a lot of other departments at Stanford and just across the country, like in other universities, I think Stanford has dedicated teaching faculty. Like these are people who they're not actually doing research necessarily at Stanford. Like their job is they're just amazing teachers and they teach these intro classes. And they also have the section leading program where they have like peers who help each other out. And I think that's pretty unique to Stanford.
Exactly. Like Eric Roberts, Julie Zielinski, Marin Sahami, Jerry Kane, and Keith Schultz. Those 5 people, I think, have changed the lives of so many people in the Bay, like in the whole world, really, because they inspired so many folks to teach as well. They showed us what it was like to really take computer science and make it teachable. And so I honestly give a ton of credit to them.
So this is jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things I wanted to get your thoughts on is you won later on when you're a grad student, you won the Centennial TA Award, the Teaching Assistant Award, which is basically, for people who don't know, it's an award given at Stanford to a teaching assistant who demonstrates a lot of care and excellence in teaching and like mentoring students. So I'm wondering, what class were you teaching where you got that? And like, how did it come to be? Like, what makes a good teacher in your mind?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, I appreciate that a lot. It's really kind of you to say. So I got the TA award. I think it was a combination of TAing CS 142, which was the web applications class, and then also CS 145, which was the databases class. And I think I give credit, first of all, to the professors who first taught me those courses. John Osterhout, who was my advisor, taught me CS 142, and then Jennifer Whittam taught me CS 145, the databases class. I think what makes a really good teacher, honestly, is, it's a great question. There are certain obvious ingredients, right? Like the ability to explain things well, the ability to be patient, the ability to sort of frame things in different ways for different people. For folks who are visual thinkers versus auditory thinkers, you have to be able to sort of, cater to their learning styles. But I think what it kind of fundamentally comes down to, Rahul, is you kind of have to be a people person, right? And actually, I give a lot of credit to the section leader program for kind of capturing this too, right? I remember, when you and I applied to be section leaders, right? In the interview process, they ask you like, take a very simple concept in computer science, but explain it to someone who has no background in computer science and try to use some sort of analogy to make it relatable to that person, right? And these are sort of long form essay type questions that aren't really easy to do. And the first time that you see them, you're like, wait a second, why am I explaining the concept of big O complexity to like a ballerina? I'm never gonna have to do this, right? But I think it's actually a phenomenal question. To be completely honest with you, I now use, I use those questions when I interview software engineering candidates at neo.tax. The very first question I ask them is, explain some concept to your parents or your grandparents or your kids, because I want to see, do they know it really, really well to the point where they can, make it accessible to somebody else, right? Can they communicate well? Do they have the fundamentals down? Are they able to make the analogy correctly so that this person will truly get it, right?
Yeah. And it sounds like that is your job today, right? Like you talked earlier about how you are the translator in your company. Like your whole job, or like a majority of your job today, is actually just doing this translation and explaining things so other people can understand. So I feel like it's super relevant.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't think about that, but I think you're spot on. Like that skill, man, it's incredibly valuable. It is unbelievably valuable, and I think it's very underrated, right? Because you're not going to learn that skill in a particular class. But you will learn that skill if you're asked to, TA a bunch of freshmen, for example.
Yeah.
And I give a ton of credit for the CS 198 section leader program. That was one of the best decisions I made in undergrad.
Yeah. I mean, the advice I give to everyone who I come across is like, if you're in a technical field, or even if you're not, it's like the ability to teach and being able to explain things will help the person who you're teaching, obviously, but you'll actually get more benefit yourself by teaching because you just learned so much in that process. So I feel like, yeah, 100% agree with you. Let's talk now about, we did section leading together at Stanford undergrad. You went on to do a master's, right? Where you did more teaching. What, at the end of your Stanford career, so you're there for 5 years, I think, right? So then how did you decide to apply for a PhD in computer science as opposed to going out into industry?
Yeah. So actually it was 6 years technically. So I spent 2 years doing my master's because so what happened was I did section leading, right? And I think you and I like had a great time doing it.
Yep.
And then my last quarter of senior year, I sort of took a step up and started TAing more high level classes. Like that was the first year that I TA'd 142 with John Osterhout. And John was like an amazing mentor. He was just an awesome person to work with. I learned a lot from him, to be honest with you. I still do to this day. And he kind of sort of like sparked this idea that actually maybe I should consider a PhD and do research, right? Like I really enjoy teaching. I really discovered that passion that I sort of, it was kindled by CS 198, by the section leading program, but it really started to flourish when I was TAing 142. And so I told myself, okay, instead of going into industry, let me stick around and not just do a 1-year co-term, but a 2-year co-term so that I can really give myself time to evaluate whether I want to, do a PhD, do research and go into academia and then teach long-term. Because that was really my goal. My goal was to teach long-term.
Interesting. So the motivation for the PhD wasn't so much about like the subject matter expertise, like you wanted to be the world expert in this particular domain. It was more about using a PhD as a way to teach more people.
Yeah. I mean, I thought to myself that, research would be complementary to teaching because, you'll be able to master certain concepts and then you'll take that mastery and help other people master it as well. So to me, it felt like I've built like the teaching part is me interfacing with the rest of the world. Let me build the rest of the pipeline so I can learn new information. And once I have that new information, I can teach it to the masses. That was kind of my thinking.
You're at Stanford and you end up actually going to MIT.
Oh, right.
Yeah. For the PhD. So like, how did you want to leave Stanford and go
I did not
else?
actually. No, I did not want to leave. I was so comfortable and so happy staying at Stanford. I felt like I had really established a home there. I had like, a huge community of friends. This is also something that you and I discovered, right? That because we came in right after the economic collapse, by the time we graduated in 2013, everyone had realized, oh, this tech boom is real. Yeah. I should just stay in the Bay Area, right? We had so many friends who were in the area still. It really didn't make sense to leave, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, Rahul, I was having this conversation with professors who were advising me. Like I talked to John Ostart about this. I talked to Chris Ray. I talked to Jennifer. I talked to Professor Philip Levis. I talked to Mehran Zahami as well. These were folks who wrote rec letters for me and stuff when I applied for the PhD. And they were all saying that like, well, you could stay here and finish sooner, but it's really helpful to go somewhere else and just get that diversity of experience, right? And like go to a new university, a new way of doing research, a new mode of thinking. That's going to help you in the long term for us. That was really what they were suggesting. And they also, in particular, were recommending MIT because they said, you shouldn't just necessarily go to university for the name brand or for the professor who you're going to work with. It's really also about the students. Because at the end of the day, when you're doing research in a PhD program, you're going to spend a lot more time working with other lab mates than you are with the professor. Yeah. You might meet with the professor once or twice a week, but you're going to talk to the students every single day. So optimize for that. And they all said that at MIT, you're going to meet a certain caliber of student that will really help you in your journey. So with that, I decided, okay, I'm going to take this risk and I'm going to go to MIT. And, it wasn't a huge risk, let's be honest. Like I was very fortunate. I got super lucky that I had all these professors who were supporting me, who wrote me, really awesome rec letters and were allowed me to sort of like get these offers from MIT, for example, or from Carnegie Mellon. And I talked to this professor who was going to join MIT's faculty. His name was Matej Zaharia. Matej was this like, hotshot PhD student who graduated from Berkeley. He put off his faculty job at MIT for 2 years and instead started a company called Databricks. And I remember when Matej hears this, he's going to think this is like sort of blasphemous, but like the conversation with him was kind of underwhelming. I remember I was talking to him on the phone. We had this like 30-minute phone call. And Matej, he's a very unassuming person, right? He doesn't have this like super forceful personality like Chris Ray does, right?
Mhm.
He's also kind of young and he's sort of shy. And so when the first time you talk to him, you're a little bit sort of taken aback because he has this incredible reputation. And when you talk to him one-on-one, you're like, wait a second, like, is that him? Like, I
Yeah.
was a little bit taken aback, right?
Yeah, and so I guess two things. The one is that I actually didn't realize that Matei started Databricks, which is insane because like Databricks is a hugely successful company now.
Oh,
He just kind of did it as like a detour on his way to a faculty position.
yeah. Well, he almost didn't take it, Rahul. Like, to be honest with you, it really felt like MIT was really worried that he would never come.
So ironically, you ended up back at Stanford after a year at MIT. So was that because Matei wanted to be closer to Databricks and he came back to Stanford, or how did that come to be?
That's exactly what happened, right? I think like in April of 2016, Matei called me into his office. And at the time, it was just me and one other grad student, Shomik Palkar. And Shomik and I weren't even actually that close at the time. We sat on opposite ends of the ninth floor of the Gates Computer Science Building at MIT, which is kind of funny.
Oh, nice.
It's also Gates. Bill Gates, I think, has sort of cornered the market on computer science.
He has all the CS buildings around the country.
Washington, Carnegie Mellon. It's not absurd. So he called me into his office and he said, like, hey, Firas, I have some news. I'm thinking about leaving MIT and going somewhere else. And I said, oh, okay. Well, where do you want to go, Matei? He said, actually, I'm thinking about moving to Stanford. And I just sort of laughed in his face because I thought it was too ironic to be true. I thought it was too funny and too coincidental. Yeah. And then after about 15 seconds, he had this very blank look on his face. And he said, no, I'm serious. And then I said, oh, wait, okay. I should stop laughing. I should take this seriously. And it was really hard because I actually, I really enjoyed my time at MIT. I really found it to be like, in a lot of ways, everything that my advisors had told me was true, right? Going somewhere else was really helpful for me. It was a new perspective on life, a new perspective on research. I learned a lot in those 9 months. I learned how to deal with the cold and how to deal with the winter. I was not used to it at all. And it was actually a very mild winter that I went through, but I thought it was just abominable. But I also recognized that like Matei was the right person to work with. And I decided, I would continue working with him. And so I moved back.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so now you're back at Stanford. This is 2016, you said, right? 2017? Yeah. Okay, so then I know it's hard, but can you try and condense your whole PhD? I think you're at Stanford now for 4 years. Give it to me 2 minutes. Highlights, lowlights.
To be honest, I think it was just really a struggle as soon as I got back to Stanford. And I think this is kind of the unfortunate part of the PhD. It's, it's hard to, the median outcome is not that great, unfortunately. And it's really, really hard, especially when, you're in this sort of very isolated environment and you deal with a lot of failures. And the PhD is naturally going to expose all of your flaws, Rahul. It's the kind of program, it's the kind of thing where, you're learning through this apprenticeship model, but the apprentice isn't around all the time. Or sorry, the mentor isn't around all the time. You are around, but the mentor is not, right? So how can you be this apprentice who's learning from the mentor when the mentor isn't always there, right? Well, you're learning from the other apprentices, right, simultaneously. Yeah. And then I think, there were a lot of false starts with my research. And I think one thing that I wasn't very good about was staying disciplined with what I wanted to work on. I sort of kept hopping around because I was very restless. I think kind of like, this is where my curiosity, I think, gets the best of me. It's good in the PhD, right? The PhD rewards breadth, not depth. And so even though I do like to think breadth first, I had to shift my way of thinking to be depth first, and that took some time. I think what really helped me, though, was I did an internship at Microsoft Research the summer of 2019. I had been sort of dabbling with industry partnerships quite a bit. So we did some work with Facebook, we did some work with Google. I spent some time contracting at Facebook. I think you and I, had lunch.
We had lunch. When you were there. Really that was
fun. But ultimately, those things, those different paths didn't pan out, right? When I got to Microsoft Research, I found a mentor who I really enjoyed working with, in Srikanth Kandula, who he was kind of if you look at those movies, those sports movies of the coaches who are really hard disciplinarians who are tough but fair and then bring out the best in their charges at the end of the movie. Srikanth was kind of like that because at the time it was really a nadir in my PhD. I was really lacking in self-confidence about myself, to be honest with you. Again, the PhD kind of beats you up a little bit mentally.
Yeah.
And it's hard to sort of stay positive throughout it. And I actually ended up working on a project with him that I had no business working on, to be honest with you. It was a networking project, traffic engineering. He picked me to work on it because he, in his proposal, when he got funding for the project, said, "Oh, we're going to use machine learning, and this is a systems problem that hasn't seen ML applied to it before. Firas has an ML background; he can do this." Right? I had spent my first 3 or 4 years of the PhD working on machine learning and systems. Right? How to take different sorts of ML tasks and optimize them without sacrificing the accuracy of the task in question. So this was kind of a different thing where I was now applying ML to a new domain, which is not quite what I was doing, but it was similar enough, right? It turned out we didn't use any machine learning at all in the project, but we instead developed this like really cool algorithm that, achieved pretty awesome like runtime improvements in the way traffic engineering was done previously. And we ended up sort of like almost matching the state of the art in terms of like, optimality, but still getting like, up to 1000x improvements in runtime. I credit Shrikant because number one, he like helped me rediscover my own sort of like self-esteem in the PhD. And I remember like, being able to work on this new project with him in this new domain that I wasn't familiar with and make progress. And that was super empowering, right? And Shrikant was the kind of person who like was very detail oriented and was willing to give attention to it. And he really helped me recognize that like, yes, the PhD is very hard, but if you put in that level of detail and effort and diligence, it's worth it. You really unlock lots of just like amazing ideas and amazing solutions, right? And to this day, the work that I'm most proud of in my PhD is the work that I did with him, because I think without it, we reached a level of technical depth in that project that I had previously never reached before in my life.
Okay, so you're like in this PhD program, you have ups and downs, starting to think about what's next. I feel like there's a couple things that are unlocked that you can only do if you have a PhD. For example, like a faculty, like a tenure track faculty position at some good university, or like Microsoft Research, Google Research, these prestigious research things in industry. And there's also other options which you don't necessarily need to have a PhD, like starting a startup or like becoming a normal engineer at Facebook. So how did you think about the world of possibilities as you're like coming to
right? Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think like in a way, I ended up stumbling upon the solution that you have found as well, right? Which is, okay, if I really like teaching, but I'm not super interested in going the academic route because the PhD has been a big slog and the work-life balance is really tough. That's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, but like it's a lot of hours and the payoff, there's a lot of delayed gratification, right?
Yeah.
And that only increases once you become faculty, right? Because now you're applying for grants instead of submitting papers or just submitting papers. And the grant proposal process is not fun either. So I think, especially after that internship at MSR, I was like, okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to work at MSR and then I'm going to teach on the side. So if I go to work at MSR in Seattle, then I'll apply for teaching positions at University of Washington and just teach computer science classes there. So after the summer of 2019, my plan shifted from go to academia and be a tenure track faculty to go to MSR and teach at University of Washington. I think what ended up also happening was I recognized that the path to MSR was still going to be, I think, it was going to take a while, mostly because I had now kind of pivoted, right? I had pivoted from doing machine learning and systems to now doing all of this sort of more classical systems and networking research, right? And so again, I think part of the way that you're evaluated as a one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that when you are sort of applying for the faculty job market, and applying to MSR is very similar, you have to kind of have this very cohesive story and this very good pitch. It's kind of like when you apply for funding from a VC, right? And you fundraise. Like for me, my story was very incoherent because I had hopped around, right? So it's going to take me some time to make that cohesive. I think, to be honest, what really sort of changed my thinking was I thought to myself, you know what? Even if I go to MSR, I'm still going to end up leading this sort of double life, right? I'm going to do research because I find that intellectually interesting. And I do like certain parts of the research process a lot. Like I love the engineering parts of it where I'm actually coding, where I'm sitting at the whiteboard, coming up with a new algorithm, where I'm testing it. The other sort of mechanics of the research, like presenting your work, writing about your work, answering rebuttals, that wasn't quite as appealing to me. And I always still wanted to teach, but it actually had been many, many years since I had taught, right? Like I had spent so much time focusing on my research that I kind of put teaching on the back burner, which was, it really also kind of, I don't want to say it hurt, but it definitely made things a little bit more difficult for me, right?
Yeah.
It would have been great if I had stayed in touch with that as I had gone through the PhD, and that was my mistake, I think. So, I had just finished my last project of the PhD, this NC Flow project with Srikanth. We submitted it right at the beginning of the pandemic. We submitted to this conference in April 2020. And to be honest, I felt sort of burnt out, to be completely honest. And I felt like I kind of just needed a break from the PhD altogether. And, we're in this very chaotic world now with COVID. I'm at home in Dallas. I'm it really, I think the pandemic really forced me to take a step back and think about everything from a 30,000 foot view.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I have been getting, folks reaching out to me about different startup ideas over the years. And, this friend of mine, Ibrahim, had reached out. He had reached out in October of 2019. At the time, I told him thanks, but no thanks, because I was still really focused on my PhD and getting into MSR. But now I was kind of more open to it. So I kind of just spent a few hours a week sort of, dabbling with him. Again, the problem domain taxes is not something that I initially thought was interesting, but I liked working with him. I think we had a really good rapport. And we clicked really, really quickly. And, it just kind of snowballed. One thing led to another. And then all of a sudden we were applying to incubators like Y Combinator. And then we were talking to investors about fundraising. And it was all over Zoom. So it was all kind of frictionless in a way. Again, the pandemic kind of helped things, weirdly enough. And, before I knew it, I was talking to Srikanth and talking to Matej and Peter and saying, hey, I'm actually going to work on this startup idea for the next X number of months. And now it's been almost a year. So.
Yeah. Then one more question about the startup experience. How did you, it sounds like it kind of fell into your lap almost, right? Ibrahim reached out to you in October. So what advice, do you have any actionable advice for other people who are thinking about, how did you vet the co-founder relationship? How did you decide to make the plunge? Any advice about starting up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So and I'm glad that you kind of honed in on the co-founder question, because I think that's the most important thing. When you talk to investors, what they really care about is the team. They don't care so much about the idea. They care about who's working on it. Because the fact of the matter is, most ideas are too hard to evaluate. It's too early stage, right? It's too soon, and it needs to be tested by the market. And only the market is going to tell you whether the idea is good or not. But what investors can bank on is, okay, these guys, this team of folks, they can figure it out even if their idea sucks. They can pivot, they can think laterally, they can think horizontally and figure out, okay, maybe our initial idea wasn't good, but this part of it is good. Let's correct the remaining portions and make it work, right? So the thing that's interesting is it's not just about brain power or about your background, right? Candidly, another thing that really helped me when we were fundraising was, investors saw the words AI, PhD, Stanford, CA next to my name. And it really, I hate to say it, but it really accelerated the conversation. I was very fortunate. I haven't even finished my PhD, but that didn't matter, right?
In some way, that's better. Right? I feel like, the PhD dropout is more attractive than the PhD.
Fortunately, yeah, that's true. That's true. But to this day on the neo.tax homepage, I put a little asterisk next to the word PhD because I don't want people to think my degree yet. Right. I do want to be honest, right? It's a disservice to the rest of the academic community to sort of claim something you didn't fully earn. Yeah. But here's what's interesting, right? The most difficult question that we got during fundraising was, how long have you been two working together? Which for us the answer was not very long, right? We had just met. But I think here's what really helped me, right? The first thing was we met through mutual friends that I trusted, right? Mutual friends that I trusted quite a bit. And they wouldn't have recommended him if they didn't think that this person was really good, right? And Ibrahim also had gone through his ups and downs throughout his journey too. And he had learned a lot of valuable lessons through his prior startup where he basically had built this coffee company from scratch. He'd also done a bunch of work at Intuit as a manager, so he knew about taxes pretty well. He had demonstrated that he could recruit people. So he found our third co-founder, Steven, right, who again is this unbelievable accountant, former IRS agent. But I think honestly, Rahul, what really made me feel comfortable working with him was he wasn't putting a ton of pressure on me. He wasn't trying to poke and prod me to join him. He was very, very upfront. He was very honest and transparent. But also I felt like he complimented me well in areas where I was weak, like his business sense, his product sense, his ability to communicate with investors is just top notch. Um, and then the last thing was when we talked about bigger philosophical questions, like what kind of culture do we want to run in our business, and like how do we want to think about hiring, and what are the main values that we want to pass on to our employees and our customers. We were like almost 100% aligned. Like it was kind of spooky, right? And that's why when I tell other aspiring founders, when they're looking at finding a co-founder, I tell them that it's a lot like dating and it's a lot like getting married, because you and your partner or your co-founders have to be really aligned, right? It doesn't mean that to be identical in your thinking, right? Like, like Rahul, you and your wife are not 100% aligned on every single thing, right? But the important thing is that when there's disagreements, you two know how to resolve them, and you know that the bedrock is sound, because on the fundamental principles that you and her both care about, there's no disagreement, right?
Yeah.
And for me and Ibrahim, it was the same thing, right? Like we're going to disagree about tactics, for example. We may even disagree about strategy, but we're not going to disagree about principles.
Yeah. And that's a good analogy too. I've heard again and again that like the co-founder relationship is very akin to a marriage, in the sense that it's very messy if you break up, and you really do want a lot of understanding at the fundamental level in terms of values. I'm also wondering, how is the stress different in a PhD versus a startup? Because I imagine in a startup, it's like what I've heard is like a treadmill. Like you have to hit the next milestone in order to get the next
like
VC funding round. Whereas in a PhD, maybe it's like similar in the sense of like having to land the next project or next paper. But like, how do you compare the stress level between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to say something that sounds kind of crazy, but I think the PhD is way more stressful than
wow. Okay.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with this unique ingredient that only the PhD really gives you, which is this challenge of dealing with isolation, right? Even when you're dealing with something, like even though tons of stuff might be on fire at the startup, the fact that you're dealing with this problem as a team, it really helps a lot, right? And you don't feel like you're shouldering this burden on your own. Whereas in the PhD, the stakes are super low technically, right?
Yeah.
You're not dealing with millions or potentially billions of dollars. You're not responsible for other shareholders, other employees. And you're not running on that treadmill, like you said, right? So for all those reasons, you would argue that the startup is more stressful. But because you're doing it by yourself, and again, maybe this is just me, if you're doing it by yourself and you feel like the sense of potentially abandonment, which it sounds like a strong word, right? But it really can get to that level when you feel like you've wasted a lot of time and you're spinning your wheels doing nothing. And you feel like, I think also like the lack of compensation is a big factor too. Like you see all of your friends who are out there making a lot more money. That also starts to weigh in your mind too, that opportunity cost. I think for those two reasons, it can really sort of eat at you. And those two factors are really, really underrated, I think.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, I can understand that for sure. Especially in Silicon Valley, where it's like you have friends who, I mean, of course, your friends are smart, but like they're not like working 10 times more than you. But because of them joining a hot startup very early on, their financial outcome is like 10 or 100x better. And that can actually really weigh psychologically on you.
Exactly. And while for me personally, like just to be candid, like I turned down other offers. I turned down, for example, like I could have worked with my friends at Robinhood in 2015. I could have postponed the PhD for a year, and I decided not to do that. I could have worked at Snap. I could have worked at Okta. That was my first actually full-time offer when I was an undergrad. I could have and Okta I had no interest in working at, but it turned out Okta was a super successful company.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That I had no idea. There were other things too. I don't want to go through the whole list, but the point is that I felt it acutely because I had never worked full-time at a company before. I had that opportunity. I deliberately passed it up. I think in hindsight, it would have benefited me tremendously. And I had to become very disciplined financially. I had to make sure that I was always managing my money well. That also has helped a lot. Like now that I'm making a better salary, I feel like a millionaire, even though I'm not even close to that. Right. So like everything kind of works out in the end. But I will say that people underestimate how difficult it is to ignore those other factors in your life when you're a PhD student.
Yeah, and I mean that's actually very interesting. That it sounds like the PhD has actually been a really good preparation for a startup, and I think that
Mhm.
neo.tax from an outsider perspective, it seems really exciting, and I know it'll do. I hope it'll do really really well going
Yeah.
forward. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had for us. Thanks so much for joining. Is there anything else that you want to share
No,
before
I
we
mean, I
wrap
think
up?
that's it. I mean, if people want to if people have more questions for me, I'm always happy to answer them. I like to think that I'm accessible. Just, hit me up on Twitter or on LinkedIn or my email address. You can find it on my website. And yeah, I mean, like at the end of the day, I think one thing that hopefully people take away from my story is I was super lucky in a lot of ways, right? Even though I had these ups and downs with the PhD, I had amazing mentors, amazing advisors, people who really championed me, who gave me a sense of direction when I needed it most. And then a lot of opportunities just fell in my lap, right?
Yeah.
And I think, if you put in the work and you make sure that you're ready to take advantage of those opportunities, then when something does come along out of the blue, you can
Mm,
seize it immediately and just jump on it.
yeah, I like that.
So that's
Surround
something to
yourself with
always remember. Yeah,
really great people and put in the work.
exactly.
Oh, I think that's amazing advice. And then your Twitter, LinkedIn, I'll leave those in the description of the video. So if anyone does have questions, they can reach you that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, thanks so much for us. I really appreciate the time and this.
Yeah, no problem. Likewise, it was great to catch up as always.